Shabbat Shalom, everybody. This is the message translated into English that Alejandro Alvarado brought us today on the first reading in the book of Leviticus, Vayikra. So the book of Leviticus, Vayikra, which we're beginning this week, is also called Torat HaKohanim. It's the instructions for the priests, the Kohanim. It mostly deals with the korbanot, the offerings to be presented in the Mishkan, or the tabernacle, we also call the tent of meeting. Vayikra is a book that from the very beginning, from the first parasha, calls us to examine the quality of our relationship with our Creator through the relationship that we have with our environment and especially with our neighbor. Our parasha this week describes the various offerings to be presented at the altar. The first set were the burnt offerings. These are called olah. An animal was brought to the entrance of the Mishkan. If it was from the cattle, the person bringing this offering would place his hands upon the animal that was being offered up, and the Kohen would sprinkle some of the blood of the dead animal upon the altar. He then skinned it, cut it into pieces, arranged the parts which were washed in a specific way, and then it was burnt on the altar. The process for the burnt offerings of other animals and birds was described along with the various vegetable or grain offerings. These are called mincha, part of which was burnt on the altar, and the rest was eaten by the Kohanim. The peace offerings, the shalamim, part of which were burnt on the altar, and the rest eaten, could have been from cattle, sheep, or goats. The expiatory sacrifices, these are called chata'at, are detailed. These cover the sins committed by error, by mistake, by either the Kohen HaGadol, or by the entire community, or by the prince, or by any common citizen. The guilt offerings, asham, were also listed. They serve to atone, to cover for certain verbal transgressions and sins related to the laws of ritual purity. Grain offerings were brought by those who couldn't afford the required guilt offering, the animal, to cover for the misappropriation of sacred property, the laws for questionable fault, and the offerings for the sin of dishonesty and cheating. The Hebrew word korban, which we find in the Torah to describe animal offerings, does not simply mean sacrifice in the sense of giving up something, nor does it mean an offering in the simple sense of bringing gifts. Instead, korban, from the root kereth, means to draw near or to approach. That means it serves to help a person get closer to God. The book of Vayikra is rich in details on the instructions, especially regulating the sacrifices and the behavior of the priests. But how are we to understand these sacrifices for us today? Some want to justify the sacrifices by saying that we have the need or the desire to show our gratitude to God for the gift of life and sustenance, in the sense that we owe something to the Creator for having created us, and that we can pay Him back. That it allows us to better deal with our feelings of guilt for our mistakes, and thus to make amends for them. This is more like the pagan idea of appeasing the gods. Our prophet Isaiah says, "What use is the multitude of your sacrifices to me, says Adonai. I am fed up with burnt offerings of rams, with the fat of animals. I do not want the blood of oxen or sheep or goats." Today, there are no such rituals. The temple at Jerusalem, where the offerings were brought, no longer exists. The service to God from the service of animals is no longer the language with which the people can communicate with the divine. So what does this have to do with us today? In the temple, the parts of the animal were taken and raised up upon the altar. This is a personal statement, a personal reference to the attempt for us to raise our material resources to a higher level, to direct them to the service of God. It's obvious that the offerings are not for God. He doesn't need them. God is almighty, and he is the owner and Lord of everything. Instead, the offerings are for us, and we are being taught to take the physical and to sanctify it. Our Hebrew sage Maimonides, Rambam, taught us our actions are composed of three elements: thought, speech, and action. This is depicted in Leviticus 1, Vayikra 1, verse 9, where God commands us to bring an offering, to lay our hands on its head. This corresponds to our actions. We must always also confess our transgressions out loud. This corresponds to our speech. And later we burn the various parts of the animal on the altar, those internal organs where thoughts and desires are generated, corresponding to our thought. The blood, the soul of the animal, was sprinkled upon the altar, depicting how the offerings symbolize our dedication, body and soul, to the Creator. It is we who must offer ourselves to God to be his servants in this world. The first word of this book, Vayikra, Leviticus, is Vayikra, and he called. In the Torah, the last letter of this word is written with a small a, an aleph in Hebrew. The aleph is the letter that symbolizes the will, the ego. It is the first letter of the Hebrew word meaning I, ani. When the individual makes himself small, like the small aleph, he creates a place for the divine presence to rest within him. He does not have a head swelled with illusions of grandeur. Last week, we studied the cloud that covered the tabernacle, and this week, we see the calling. Again, the Borei Olam is teaching us about teshuvah. After the cloud, which represents concealment, being hidden, we receive the call, his revelation. And that is when we can approach our Creator by doing teshuvah, returning to him. The Eternal allows us to approach him daily with a willing heart so that we can enjoy his presence in our lives every single moment of every single day. Shabbat Shalom.